seen as an advocacy tool to influence housing policy across the province. There was an election that was happening, and so our teams, like, how do we leverage this election? How do we take advantage of this? So we developed this amazing policy advocacy tool. Just going to bear with me for a second as I work through the. There we go. Okay. So what I'm going to do this morning is just to do a brief introduction of our organization and who we are. Then I'm going to talk about how we articulated the need and the investment that is needed to address the affordable housing need that we have in the province. Then I'll look at leveraging partnerships, some strategies and recommendations that we make in the plan, and then just have some concluding remarks. So the focus of the paper that I submitted was really generally about the plan and how we pivot, or we look at leveraging partnerships to address the housing crisis. So I'll get into that a bit more. And really, I just also want to reiterate that this is an advocacy tool, and that we want to use that to influence policy around investment. A little bit about who we are. Some of my colleagues. So just a little bit about me. I started at the BC Nonprofit Housing Association in March of this year. So I'm pretty new to the organization still, but very excited. So I will do my best to answer some of your questions, but I may have to get back to you on some of them. So just wanted to put that out there. So the BC Nonprofit Housing Association was formed 25 years ago. Our founding executive director got into Winnebago and drove around the province of British Columbia, doing grassroots organizing of nonprofit housing providers in the province, with the idea that our voices are stronger together. And so she really saw a need, and a group of organizers really saw a need to combine our resources, to leverage our assets, to be able to, and make our voices stronger, to be able to influence policy. We're the provincial umbrella organization for the nonprofit housing sector, and we have almost 600 members, who provide around 60,000 units of long-term affordable housing. I always feel a bit funny when I say that when I'm presenting in like Toronto, where they're like 150,000 units or more, right? But in BC, we don't have this big population. We have 60,000, but 60,000 units. And that's in approximately 2,500 buildings across the province. What do we do? So our services for our members are research and advocacy. I'll be talking about that today. We do education and member engagement as well. We need to make sure that we're actually advocating for the needs of our members. We support our members in doing asset management. We do building condition assessments and energy audits. We also do learning events like our regional education, networking, and trade shows, our rents, and our our Housing Central Conference, which is, as Jeff said, in 3 days. And then we also have partner programs, like we do bulk purchasing. We have pooled investment funds for our members to pool their reserved funds. And we also have other kind of discounted programs with TELUS. So the motto of our department, the Research and Policy Department, is what gets measured, what gets measured gets done. Wow, that's a bit more of a tongue twister than I thought it was. And so that was kind of the impetus. That's the motivation behind developing our plan. So with cross-sector partners, we developed the Affordable Housing Plan for BC. And the purpose was really to determine what the rental housing demand, so starting in 2016 at the time of the study, and we wanted to project that demand out 10 years to 2026. And we also wanted to estimate the cost to address the supply, and we also wanted to estimate the cost to address the repair challenges that our sector in particular was experiencing. So the outcome really of this is the policy recommendations to make this happen, or how we articulated, how we think it should happen. And good news is that we've been able to influence policy, but I'll get into that in a little bit later. So we had to articulate demand. So we estimated, so I'm not going to go into a lot of the details. We can talk about that later. So I only have 20 minutes. But really, we estimated the demand for rental housing to be approximately 7,000 households across the province per year over 10 years. So that just means renter households. So that could be households becoming renter households. It could be newly merging renter households. And what we found when we looked at the census data was that we saw renter households increasing at a faster rate than owner households were increasing for the first time ever in our history. So we're like, okay, what's happening here? How can we address this? But a caveat is that though we also estimated that the rate of growth will gradually decline over time. So we estimated that we need about 2,300 projected. We projected that 2,300 households will be in core housing need, and then in an annual average of around 1,100 households were projected to be missing middle households. And so missing middle households have an income between $30,000 a year and $76,000 a year. And also households that may have difficulty finding suitable private market. We also projected about 3,500 households would be fine in the market. So we also acknowledge that there are households that can afford the rental housing market. So we estimated demand. And then we needed to articulate how we were going to respond to that demand. So our demand estimates provided some insight into our future supply needs. And really, we noticed that the lack of significant investment over the last 25 years has led to a significant backlog. So if we start in 2016, we estimated that we would need approximately 80,000 affordable, adequate, suitable units to actually get us to a place where we address the backlog. And then we still needed to do we still need to contribute additional units to deal with demand. So this graph that you're looking at right now is the current supply. It takes into account current supply backlog plus the need for missing middle and core housing need renter households. And then it also indicates the high end of market demand as well. So we use this image to articulate the need to our cross-sector partners and as an advocacy tool as well. And so I just showed you what we used in terms of identifying rental markets. We also took into account the number of people and individuals experiencing homelessness at any given time in the province. And then we also identified the 117,000 households that needed help affording rent in their current units. So they were living in units that were already appropriate, suitable, and adequate, but there's just an affordability gap. So we also identified that as something that needed to be addressed. So again, the 80,000 units that needed to fix the backlog, and then we estimate that we need an additional 7,000 per year over the next 10 years to address market and then subsidized and social housing needs. So that is around approximately 1.25 billion investment is needed over 10 years just to actually address the supply issue. So we frame the problem, but then how do we address it? How do we address this demand and supply challenges? And we really see that we're going to address that through leveraging partnerships. We talk a lot about the community housing sector. So the community housing sector we see as co-ops, nonprofits, local governments, charities, financial institutions, faith-based groups, private sector, community land trusts, and housing providers. They're local partners that all have a stake in building and maintaining a long-term supply of affordable housing. For instance, we worked very closely with an organization called Landlord BC. Well, they represent private sector landlords, but they have a very keen interest in the question of addressing affordable housing and building of supply. We also see that the community housing sector has the equity to leverage its share of investment needed in partnership with the province and the federal government as well. So we're not saying we just need the funding, just give us the funding and we'll do something. We're just like, no, we're actually equal partners in this. We can invest as well. So solving the housing crisis really requires a collaborative approach across senior levels of government and with us. And it's the only way we see is how we're going to actually address the challenge. So leveraging our partnerships, this is how we estimate it. So we estimate that in total we need about $1.8 billion per year investment to address it. So that includes the supply, nonprofit repair, income support, so addressing that affordability gap, and then also addressing homelessness as well. So we developed this financial model that made a variety of assumptions about a development program in regional districts across BC. So I say a development program, it's like the ideal development program. So the model assumes a mixed income and cross-subsidy approach where higher rents are offsetting the lower rents, right? So higher income households are offsetting lower income household rents. We see these as more financially stable over time because they don't require ongoing operating agreements. And we also are assuming in this model that tenant rents for the folks in core housing needs, or what we would call the core housing households, and then the missing middle are also contributing to the financial viability of these projects. Sorry, I know I'm talking really quickly. I just want to make sure I get through this. So in recognition that previous government funding programs were generally top-down and one-size-fits-all approaches, where senior levels of government tied funding and capital grants to prescriptive operating agreements that really limited our sector to be able to meet changing household needs or housing needs. We really, our approach really is that we as a sector have to be considered as an equal partner in addressing this. And so we are the community connection, but we also bring a lot of assets with us as well. But we also are the ones that are responding on the ground, right? So we're not isolated in an office somewhere in a large bureaucracy. We're actually providing the services, and so we really need to be an equal partner in this. So, but going back to that, this meant that the sector was very vulnerable to cutbacks and shifting political winds. And I don't know if some of you are familiar with what happened in the province of British Columbia in 2001. We had a Liberal government elected, and a lot of our social programs were cut or fairly decimated. We didn't see a lot of investment in any social programs. We still maintained BC Housing, which is a provincial level housing program. However, it wasn't able to do the investments that were needed. So we see involving the community housing sector as a way to strengthen strengthen the ability to address the housing crisis if we keep investment in community that won't be necessarily subject to changing political winds particularly. And we're also able to have some independence to provide housing for a wide range of households. So considering our past lessons again, around being vulnerable to cutbacks and changing political environments, we see a new approach to deliver affordable housing must be based on a model that is self-sustaining over the long term and not wholly reliant on government funding, and that we need to leverage past investments by seeing an expanded community housing sector. So in 2015, the province of British Columbia allowed or had a program, the nonprofit property transfer program, and a number of nonprofit housing providers were able to purchase provincially owned buildings. So we actually, and that was an investment that was done by previous governments, previous generations, and so that is now in our sector, and we're now able to leverage those portfolios. We came up with 4 strategies to overcome the affordable housing crisis. Really, I'm going to talk about the supply strategy and the innovation strategy in the spirit of the theme of the conference. And really, our recommendations are very policy-driven, or policy-driven. So our first recommendation around how do we expand supply is really leveraging the traditional tools that still exist. We've got a lot of opportunity there. So things like we're Really working with municipalities around identifying land and provincial governments. We have municipalities that say, well, we don't really have any land, but we know they do, so how do we work with them to leverage that land, right? I mentioned the nonprofit asset transfer program. We also can leverage, in terms of land, our faith-based partners have a lot of land. And the provincial government has actually recognized that recently and is now working directly with the United Church in British Columbia to be able to utilize their land and build more units. So it's very cool. But we also still see that we need capital grants and we still need forgivable loans. The other one is like working with municipalities, so supporting the regeneration of private purpose-built rental stock. We need to work with municipalities to amend their rate of change bylaws to ensure that we can redevelop as well. We find that, so we have now seen some historic investment in the province, but the buck stops at municipalities. If we can't, through the permitting process, applications are denied, if we have a strong resistance from the neighborhood, then we actually, it's more challenging for us to build. So we actually need to work directly with our municipal partners to be able to deliver these units. We also need to leverage the capacity we have in the community housing sector. So particularly around supporting asset management. So we have a challenge with buildings that need a lot of repair. So how do we build relationships across the sector too, right? So not just with other levels of government, but across the sector to support doing that work. And then we also need to look at expanding energy efficiency programs. So since our paper, or since the plan was developed, the BC Nonprofit Housing Association gets funding from Fortis BC, which is our like semi-private gas company, and we get funding from them to do energy audits. And so if we start making our buildings more energy efficient, that eventually will be downloaded onto the tenants and they will be able to save more money, and it's just this, it's a win-win for everyone. So in terms of our final strategy 4, so applying innovative solutions to partnerships within the sector. So one of the things we wanted to look at was exploring partnerships and aggregation. So the majority of our members have a smaller amount of units, right? We have a few big providers, but we have all these units like spread across the province. So you're like, maybe we should think about aggregating that. You know, in recognition that diversity allows us to be more connected in our communities, but it also prevents us from having a portfolio approach, so being able to leverage across portfolios. And so we're really looking and advocating to incentivize partnerships between our organizations to work together to then develop those kinds of portfolio approaches. So those who have more can actually support those who have less units, I mean. We also talked about expanding shared equity home ownership. That was discussed a bit last night. This is something that we see will help kind of alleviate some of the stress in the rental market. We had originally talked about doing these in terms of creating speculation-free zones. Speculation is fairly rampant in the Lower Mainland, particularly in the province, and also Vancouver Island and other areas as well. But we now have a speculation and vacancy tax in British Columbia. This is a fairly new tax. I'd like to say that it was partly influenced by the work that we did. But it's just beginning, so we don't know what the outcome is going to be. But it's encouraging to see that the provincial government is thinking about this. We also, you know, I think everyone in this room understands the relationship between transportation and housing as well. And we are working to influence, and we recommend that we need to actually have some transportation and housing funding like integrated, right? More integrated, particularly at the municipal level. So for instance, I currently live in a brand new rental building. I've never lived in a brand new building in my entire life. It's an interesting experience. And it was built as part of a program called the Rental 100, which is a policy program developed by the City of Vancouver, where it was encouraging land assembly along transit corridors. And so the location of and there was incentives for the private sector to developer to be able to do this, right? So they were trying to tie those two things together. It's clunky and cumbersome. It also means that renter households are living in smog-filled corridors, and so that's a topic for another time. But it is the beginning of looking at how housing affordability and transportation can work together too. So just in conclusion, so we see the community housing sector as really being an equal partner in addressing the affordable housing crisis that we're having in British Columbia. And that we actually can, and through this process, we can provide economic stimulus and really address crises on the ground in our communities. And I just want to add that the provincial government, in its 2017 budget, announced something called the 30-point plan for affordable housing in BC, which was directly influenced by our affordable housing plan for British Columbia. There's a few different numbers, but really they took those recommendations because of the group of partners that we were working with too. Our voice was very loud, and they are integrating some of the recommendations that we have. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.